Hi everyone, it's Thorin, and in this video I want to talk about credentials as those things are related to magical practice, whether that means being a witch, being a tarot reader, being some other brand of magician or occultist, etc. Credentials are one of those things that we're told to look for, I think, as beginners. When you first start hearing about the need for discernment, one of the things that folks will point to is what sort of training does this person have? How are they qualified to teach the things that they say that they know? And then the other side of that coin is folks who aren't beginners, who are interested perhaps in taking next steps. They're moving from intermediate spaces into advanced spaces, whatever that might mean or look like. And how do they go about marking those kinds of transitions? How do they mark themselves as an authority? How can they be sure that they're checking all those boxes of expertise? What sort of credentialing exists within our own communities? This topic is at the fore of my mind because of a few conversations I've been involved in recently. First of all, on my Patreon Discord earlier this week, we were talking about tarot courses and tarot certification. One of the things we like to think about is divination. I'm very passionate about tarot. There are lots of folks in my Discord who do other kinds of divinatory practice, and we were talking about who gets to write books, who becomes like a tarot teacher, how do we know what's fair when people sign up and take courses, and then is tarot certification a real thing that we should respect? The other reason this is at the fore of my mind is because I'm a student. I'm in kind of this unique position as a doctoral student where I'm in religious studies. I'm focusing on topics that are relevant to occultists, witches, magicians, pagans in some very real ways. I'm not necessarily directly like interrogating my own communities as subjects, but the things that I like to study definitely touch on those things. And the result of that is that I am often put in this position or put myself in this position where I am the expert talking about whatever the thing is. Sometimes that means being the person who does the Halloween newspaper interview that seems to always happen around October. And most recently, I was a guest on the podcast / YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast, which focuses on religious literacy and tends to interview people and produce content by people who have usually doctoral degrees in the field of religious studies. So how did I end up there? Additionally, you might have seen on Twitter that the University of South Carolina has begun advertising for an MA in magic. I believe it's through the history department. And I saw a lot of responses from folks online who were saying things like, oh, I wish I could do that. Oh, that sounds so great. Oh, wouldn't that be just so cool, like as a magical practitioner, to get that kind of access to this like specialized advanced sort of training or knowledge. Another way to examine credentialing is if you look at whatever occult magical books you might have on hand, take a look at the author bios and see what kinds of credentials the authors point to establish their authority. So for some people that will mean some sort of accredited type of degree. I've definitely seen creators on YouTube, you can probably name a few big ones, who will show their diplomas before they start speaking. Other people point to particular trainings within covens, for example, or initiations within magical fraternities, etc. What kinds of things do authors and teachers put in their bios and on their websites and on their Patreon pages and whatever to assert that they are authorities? The first thought that I have offhand that I want to start with is that credentialing is super messy anyway in practically any field, and it's even messier in magical spaces because I think magical traditions as a whole, especially something like witchcraft, are often so focused on the development of the self that the idea that we need particular kinds of boxes that we can check in order to establish authority within a network of people is antithetical to a lot of what many of us are up to. So for example, if you're practicing a personal kind of eclectic spirituality, then you're really only answering to yourself. It's about your connection to yourself, the symbols that you decide are significant within your own kind of cosmology, and nobody else really has a say in that. Nobody's the boss of you. So what is there to assert over other people? Does it necessarily matter if somebody else thinks that you don't know what you're talking about or whatever? If you're operating within a social structure, though, like a fraternal order, maybe an initiatory coven, then credentialing takes on a particular kind of weight within some of those contexts. For example, I'm a Gardnerian initiate, I run a Gardnerian coven, I have Gardnerian initiates and Gardnerian covens off of my coven, which means that I need to be able to demonstrate the authority to make those claims. But I only need to do that within my community. When I'm like hanging out at Pagan Pride Day or going to like the local bar for like pagan social night, I don't need to whip out any kind of membership card, because the fact that I'm a Gardnerian initiate is not relevant to anybody who isn't a Gardnerian. The authority only extends within my community. It does not make me the boss of other types of witches. It does not make me an authority on witchcraft as a whole necessarily. All it does is confer a particular place within a network of witches. And we could presume a certain level of expertise based on that kind of credential, but it's not necessarily a guaranteed thing, right? So a seeker who was approaching me for initiation into the Gardnerian tradition would want to verify amongst other Gardnerians that in fact I had those credentials and could bestow that upon them. But it wouldn't be a guarantee that I was, for example, a moral person or a smart person or somebody who was fun and interesting to hang out with who ran a healthy coven. It's kind of like how just because somebody has been to a university or a college and has a degree, that doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the quality of their education. My cynical and funny friend Corvus likes to say that somebody who graduates at the bottom of their med school class is still a doctor. They might not be the doctor that you want to see in a life-threatening emergency, but most of us, when we see doctors, don't ask what number they were in their graduating class. We just trust that they know more than us just by virtue of going to med school. Another place where credentialing gets really messy, which is kind of everywhere, is where it intersects with capitalism and marketing and people trying to make their livelihood, which we saw earlier when we were talking about what sorts of things will authors do and write in their bios to convince readers that they are authorities. If I am asking you to spend money for some service that I am providing, I need to convince you, my potential customer, that I am worth spending money on, that I know what I'm talking about, that I can render whatever service it is that I'm promising. And for a lot of folks, that means providing some kind of credential. It might be how many years they've been doing the thing. Oh, I've been a witch for more than 20 years, or I've been reading tarot cards for more than 40 years. Sometimes it's some kind of certificate, like they took some kind of training course in tarot. They have particular kinds of initiations. Maybe they have some kind of traditional university degree that's relevant to the thing that they're talking about, like psychology, for example. And then at that point, it falls to the consumer to discern what that credential actually means, like in a real, tangible way. And realize too that those credentials are a marketing strategy and can be spun in the same way that a newspaper headline or a statistic can be manipulated in order to make a reader think something particular is true when it might actually be more complicated than that. An example of that might be if I tell you that I have an advanced degree in religious studies, and I allow you to think, because I'm writing about witchcraft, that that means I spent all of my time studying witchcraft, when actually my focus was on evangelical Christianity. It may not immediately be dishonest per se, but there's an implication happening there where I'm consciously spinning my background, me as this imaginary person. I didn't spend all of my time thinking about evangelicals, by the way, but as this imaginary scholar who just sort of casually allows the reader to make assumptions that might be untrue. So all that to say that even if somebody looks like they have particular credentials, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have have the authority to be speaking in whatever circles that they're speaking in. I mean, we would hope that that's the case, and often it is the case, but it's just something to be mindful of, especially if you're buying something or paying somebody for something. You see this all the time in occult spaces. It's actually kind of a joke in occult spaces, and has been for like 100 years at least. You'll see folks write PhD after their names if they're publishing a book of whatever, and the assumption there that they want readers to make, or their marketer or publisher wants readers to make, is, well, they're a PhD, they're some sort of doctor, therefore they're an authority. But that doesn't mean that the doctorate is in that thing, right? When people talk about Dr. Raymond Buckland or Dr. Gerald Gardner, they're usually not telling you, well, where did that come from? What was it in? Etc. They let the reader assume that that makes them qualified to talk about the thing. If I have a PhD in, I don't know, I'm going to make something up, like education, or like composition and rhetoric or something, and I'm writing a book about, I don't know, the history of some fraternal order, or maybe a divination system or something. Well, does me having a PhD in physics or education or rhetoric necessarily matter if I'm writing about this other thing that maybe isn't related? It might say something about my experience in other ways, or maybe my intellectual capacity or my writing experience. But there's this tendency, particularly in occult and New Age spaces in particular, will do this. If you look at the metaphysical section of many big box bookstores, you'll see there's a lot of PhDs floating around. And if you investigate them, they're often not related to whatever the topic of the book is, or they're not from accredited schools. And we could have a whole other conversation about accreditation and whether or not that matters and what that is. But all that to say, just because somebody appears to have the credential doesn't mean it's not worth interrogating if you're a consumer. Now, on that other side of the coin I was talking about, for more intermediate and advanced folks who are interested in some kind of credentialing, whether that means signing up for tarot courses or maybe taking courses in witchcraft or magic, and often those kinds of things are really expensive. Are those things worth pursuing? Are those things necessary for taking those next steps? I'd say that there's a couple of things to think about there. First, I would say you have to ask yourself what your end goal is, because that's going to tell you whether or not the thing is worth doing. If your end goal is, I want to start marketing my services and I want to look authentic and believable and, worthwhile to potential customers, then you're kind of in that gray area where it depends on how discerning your customers are. See the first several minutes of this video. Is the client base that you are courting going to be impressed by whatever the credential is that you're thinking about? The question to me that's more important is, are you actually going to be learning something that's worthwhile? Now, for somebody like me, I like a lot of structure. I really like having mentors and homework and curricula to wade through in an organized sort of way that really just kind of jives really naturally with how my brain works. So I am a big fan of like the organized course, and provided that I can afford it and it fits into my schedule, I'm happy to pay for something like a correspondence course. The certificate at the end of the course doesn't matter very much to me. I've never been in a situation in like a magical or occult context where I needed to whip out a certificate that asserted that I was some kind of authority. I've got a couple things on my walls here kind of for my own like personal gratification, but like, I'm not in a position where I am selling anything. I'm not a professional tarot reader. I'm not teaching witchcraft classes online for money. I'm not doing any of that stuff. So there's nobody to impress with a certificate or persuade with a certificate. So that to me is the least meaningful part of any kind of course or, mentorship I've ever undergone. If I were operating a tarot business and I were trying to support myself with tarot, then maybe I would spin that with, oh, I've studied with this person and I have this certificate, and according to this program I have this kind of rank, etc. But as an enthusiast just in her office using tarot as a divination tool for myself and like self-improvement, etc., that stuff doesn't serve me in any way. Instead, what matters is, did I learn the thing? Am I learning the thing? Can I do the thing good? And if that's the criteria that I'm using, then when I'm searching for a mentor or I'm searching for courses to take, things to study, in turn, I'm not necessarily looking for them to have those kinds of like formalized credentials. I don't need to see the certificates on their wall necessarily. Rather, I'm reading their materials and hanging out with them and just deciding, hey, does this person know what they're doing? Are they doing something that would be beneficial to me? Would learning this thing improve my practice somehow? So those are the questions I'd ask myself in those cases. Am I trying to sell something? Am I trying to build some kind of platform, like as a business? Am I trying to monetize myself? Am I trying to just learn something? All of those questions are going to help you in deciding whether or not a particular credential is worth it. I'm going to end here with just some general reminders that we should always have at the fore, whether we are beginners looking for teachers or we're more experienced people trying to take the next steps, like whatever it is, or if we're just consumers looking for readers or teachers or whatever. Some general things to think about are that something being really expensive doesn't mean that it's good or worth your time. Credentials on paper can always be either outright fabricated or spun in such a way that maybe they should raise some questions for us. If you've ever written a resume, you know how this works, right? There's an element of, if not outright lying, spin in order to get particular kinds of positions. Sort of like how if I'm a GM for a D&D group, I can spin that into being a project manager. I mean, it's true, right? Is it necessarily what my boss wants to hear? And then finally, because I'm a university student, I work at a university, I spend a lot of time at universities, this is your always and forever reminder that the ability to attend a university is primarily about how much money you have, not how smart you are. College is great. I've done a lot of things as a student and as a teacher in those situations that have made me a better practitioner, a better magician, a better witch, but those things by themselves do not necessarily have anything to do with magical practice, and people who have not had those opportunities, whether because they haven't been afforded them or because they chose not to go, those people are not lesser as practitioners in any way. You don't need to go to USC and get a degree in magic in order to be a badass who knows a whole lot about magic, i.e., but it totally sounds awesome and a lot of fun. And if you can go, then more power to you. I hope you all are well and your new year is off to a good start.